There was something about that woman that Thomas Ashford could not put a name to the first time he watched her work. It was the height of the grape harvest, the Sonoma Valley sun falling like melted lead from 8 o'clock in the morning, and she was cutting cluster after cluster without ever pausing to wipe the sweat from her brow. Her apron was stained purple to the knees, her hands moving through the vines with the kind of precision that only comes from a body that has repeated the same motion thousands of times. Her back stayed straight, even as the basket grew heavier and heavier on her hip. She never asked for shade when the others stopped to rest. She never slowed her pace when the rest of the crew grew tired. It was just her and the work, as if the two of them shared some old understanding that needed no witnesses. Thomas reined in his horse at the top of the ridge that divided the vineyard rows, and he stayed there, motionless, without quite understanding what kept him rooted to that spot, when there were a dozen things waiting for him elsewhere on the ranch. In his 7 years running that land, he had watched hundreds of seasonal workers pass through, men and women who arrived with the harvest and left with it, leaving behind nothing but the memory of shears clicking and the sweet, heavy smell of crushed grapes. But there was something about this woman that didn't fit any category he knew. The ranch, Ashford Vineyard, stretched across the valley floor like a green blanket pulled taut between two bone-colored ridgelines, row after row of vines heavy with dark fruit, planted by hands that were long gone, tended now by hands that had come from somewhere else and would leave again without anyone remembering their names. Grace Bennett had arrived 6 days earlier with a crew of 25 migrant workers who moved from ranch to ranch across Sonoma and Napa counties during the crush. She was 26 years old, her light brown hair braided beneath a faded bandana, her skin weathered by every road she had ever walked, her hands carrying more history than any word she was willing to say out loud. She had come from Modesto, where she'd spent the last several months doing other people's laundry and taking in mending work. Before Modesto, it had been Turlock. Before Turlock, Merced. That was how her years had gone. Arriving, working, leaving before anyone had the chance to ask too many questions. It wasn't that she had something to hide exactly. It was that her story wasn't the kind people could hear without their faces changing, and she could not stand watching that change happen in someone else's eyes. She had grown up in the house of a distant aunt, Aunt Agnes, who had taken her in when she was 8 years old, after her mother died of a fever and no one else would claim her. Her father had never really existed, not in any version of the story that had ever reached her. Taken in wasn't quite the right phrase for what Aunt Agnes did. She accepted the girl because they shared blood. And in small-town America in the 1950s, you didn't leave a child out on the street. But she made it clear from the very first day that this was charity, not love. Grace grew up understanding the difference between living under a roof and belonging to it. She never belonged to it. She was the girl in the kitchen who rose before the rooster to light the stove, who ate after everyone else had finished, who never once appeared in a single family photograph. At 10, she was washing clothes down at the creek. At 12, she was minding her younger cousins whenever her aunt woke up with one of her headaches. At 14, she was hemming dresses for the neighbor women, and every dollar went straight into her aunt's hand, who called it fair payment for the favor of keeping her. What Aunt Agnes felt for her was never declared hatred. It was something slicker than that, a constant low-grade weariness at her very presence that showed itself in small daily cruelties. A sharp word here, a colder plate of food there, the particular way of pretending not to hear her when she spoke. None of it left a visible mark, but it carved away at a girl on the inside in a way that takes years to fully understand. When Grace turned 17, her aunt began bringing up marriage, not with the hope of a woman wanting to see her niece settled well, but with the tone of someone resolving an inconvenience. There was a widower in town, owner of the local feed store, willing to marry a young girl who could keep his house for him. Her aunt treated it like a done deal. Grace met the man exactly once and understood, without needing further proof, that the life waiting for her there would be equal to or worse than the one she already knew. She waited. She kept quiet. And one March morning before dawn, she packed the few things she owned and left without saying goodbye to anyone. 9 years alone on the road followed. 9 years learning that the world does not slow down for a woman with no family name behind her, that a young woman, pretty enough to draw attention, with no one to vouch for her, was a problem for everybody, that some doors opened and other doors slammed shut, and the difference between the two almost always came down to whose daughter you were. Grace wasn't anybody's daughter who mattered, so she learned to be her own. She learned to outwork anyone in the field, to complain less than anyone else, to smile when a smile was needed, and to disappear when disappearing was the safer choice. There had been a winter, 2 years into her wandering, when work dried up all along the valley and she'd gone 4 days on almost nothing, sleeping in the back of a feed barn outside a town she never bothered to learn the name of, because learning names meant staying, and staying meant being found. A rancher's wife had caught her stealing eggs from the hen house on the 5th morning, and instead of calling the sheriff, had sat her down at the kitchen table and fed her until she couldn't eat another bite, asking no questions Grace couldn't answer with a shrug. That woman had died the following spring, Grace heard later, second-hand, from someone passing through. She never learned her name either. But she carried the memory of that kitchen table the way other people carried photographs, and it was, for a long time, the only proof she had that kindness existed in the world without a hook buried somewhere inside it. There had also been men along the road who mistook her solitude for an invitation, who cornered her in barns or behind cookhouses, thinking a woman traveling alone had no one to answer to and nothing to lose. Grace had learned early to carry a folding knife in her apron pocket and to sleep with one eye open, and more than once she had walked away from a job rather than stay one more night somewhere a man's eyes had lingered too long. She never spoke of those nights to anyone. They lived in her the way old scars live under a sleeve, invisible until someone happened to touch the wrong place. She had arrived at Ashford Vineyard on a Sunday at first light, when the fog still hadn't lifted off the valley floor and the oak trees at the entrance gate glistened with dew. The foreman, a lean, weathered man named Walter Briggs, who had survived 2 decades of hard ranch work by keeping his mouth shut and his hands busy, gathered the new crew with the brevity of a man who had no patience for ceremony. He laid out the rules of the property, pointed toward the bunkhouses where the men and women would sleep separately, told them the harvest would run 8 weeks, that anyone who worked hard would collect full pay plus a letter of recommendation, and that anyone who caused trouble would be gone that same day without a dime. Grace listened to all of it, nodded when a nod was called for, and went to drop her bag in the women's bunkhouse. It was on the 6th day that Thomas truly saw her. He had caught a glimpse of a rider on the ridge the day before, but from a distance, without paying it much mind. That Thursday morning, Thomas rode down through the vineyard rows on a grey gelding, Walter beside him, making the rounds that had apparently become his habit. Grace was working a row near the road and looked up on pure instinct when she heard the hooves. He was not the kind of man she expected to find running an operation like this one. She guessed him at around 42, tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that came from real work, not from sitting behind a desk. His hat was pushed back off his forehead, his face marked by the sun and by something deeper than the sun, something inside him that had left its own kind of weathering, the kind that time alone doesn't explain. He didn't carry the arrogance of the wealthy landowners she'd crossed paths with on other ranches, that habit of looking at farmhands like part of the scenery. But he didn't carry warmth either. There was a distance in him that wasn't contempt. It was something else, the look of a man who had learned to keep himself at arm's length as a way of protecting himself, not as a way of feeling above anyone. Thomas passed the row where Grace was working, and for a fraction of a second his eyes stopped on her. She didn't look away, which was unusual. Most of the female workers averted their eyes when the owner rode past. Grace looked back at him directly, not with defiance, but with the plain steadiness of someone who no longer had anything left to lose in front of other people's opinions. Thomas kept riding, but something about that exchanged glance stuck in him like a splinter caught in rope. That night, sitting on the porch after supper, Thomas found himself thinking without quite knowing what about. Walter had mentioned something about the new worker earlier, that she cut faster than the rest, that she didn't waste words, that she carried a kind of focus that looked almost like anger. Thomas had answered with something non-committal and changed the subject, but the image of that woman's direct stare stayed with him longer than it should have. The ranch belonged to his father, Harold Ashford, who had handed over the day-to-day management 9 years earlier, when his health had truly begun to fail. Harold was 72, though he looked older, A lung condition kept him bedridden more often than he was on his feet, and there were days it seemed he wouldn't make it through the week. But he was stubborn as old oak root, and every time death drew close he found the strength to push it back. Sick as he was, he still gave the orders. He was the kind of man who had built that ranch up from a rented parcel of scrubland, through sheer negotiation and decisions made with the precision of a man who couldn't afford to be wrong. And he had a very clear vision for his only son's future. Thomas needed to marry a woman from a known family in the region, someone who would bring more land or more social standing to the Ashford name. Harold already had someone picked out. Eleanor Prescott had been widowed 3 years earlier, owner of a sizable neighboring ranch, 40 years old, a woman who knew exactly how to present herself and had let the right people know she was open to a second marriage. What Harold didn't know, because his son had never found the nerve to tell him, was that his son didn't want that life. It wasn't that he rejected the ranch. It was that there was a version of Thomas Ashford who had never gotten to exist, buried since he was 21, when his father made it plain that his destiny was to stay and mind the land. There had once been a young man who wanted to study law in Sacramento, who read everything the school teacher would lend him, who dreamed of a life bigger than the horizon of that valley. That young man was buried with a firm hand, and Thomas Ashford became the rancher his father needed him to be. He was good at it, efficient, respected by the workers and the neighbors alike, but there was a drought inside him that had nothing to do with rainfall, the loneliness of a man surrounded by people and never truly seen by any of them. In the days that followed, Thomas began to notice that his rounds through the vineyard had developed a pattern he hadn't consciously chosen. He passed the section where Grace worked more often than he passed any other. He never stopped, never spoke, nothing that could be called open interest. Ruth, the ranch cook, a woman of 52 who had seen more than most people gave her credit for, noticed before anyone else. One afternoon, while he drank his coffee on the porch, she lingered a moment longer than usual, looking out toward the vineyard, and said, without looking at him, that the new woman in the crew had a way of working like she was proving something to somebody who wasn't there. Thomas said he hadn't noticed. Ruth shook her head like a woman who knew she was being lied to, and went back inside to the kitchen. Grace, for her part, had begun to notice Thomas's presence in a way that unsettled her. It wasn't that he did anything improper. It was exactly the opposite. He did nothing at all. He passed by, looked from a distance, kept going. But there was a different quality to that look, something she still couldn't name. It wasn't the look of an owner sizing up labor. And it wasn't the look of a man eyeing a pretty woman with clear intentions. It was a look of recognition, as if he was seeing something he already knew from somewhere else. And that possibility scared her more than anything. Grace had learned to make herself invisible as a survival strategy. Being truly seen was dangerous, because when people truly saw you, they wanted to know where you came from and who you were, and those questions always complicated everything. On the afternoon of the 11th day since her arrival, when the sun was low and the light had turned gold between the rows, Thomas stopped his horse in front of her. It didn't look intentional. The animal seemed to have halted on its own, and he was studying a cluster of grapes with what looked like professional interest. Grace kept cutting, but she was aware of every inch of distance between them. After a moment, without taking his eyes off the vines, he said that she was cutting at the correct angle, that most new workers snapped the stem wrong and ruined the cluster, but that she didn't. Grace answered in that direct voice that was her way, saying she'd learned that on another ranch a long time ago, that she made every mistake exactly once and never again after that. Thomas turned to look at her then, and for a moment the two of them looked at each other differently than they had before. There was a mutual honesty in it that didn't need any more words. He asked, almost against his own better judgment, where she'd learned to work a vineyard like that. Grace hesitated, weighing the question the way she weighed every question a person in power asked her, trying to guess what answer would keep her safest. In the end, she told him the truth, or a small piece of it, that she'd worked 3 harvests before this one, that a foreman in the San Joaquin Valley had once told her she cut faster than any man on his crew, and she'd decided that was worth remembering, even if nothing else about that season was. Thomas said that didn't surprise him. He rode off without saying anything further, but she carried those simple words with her the rest of the afternoon. Not for what they said, but for the tone behind them. There was no condescension in it. There was only the observation of someone who understood work, speaking to someone who understood it too. That night, Grace pulled an old folded photograph from her bag, the only picture she had of her mother, taken before the sickness took hold, back when Grace was barely old enough to walk. She didn't look at it often, because looking at it hurt in a way she couldn't quite name. That night she held it for a moment and put it away again. She lay listening to the breathing of the other women and stared at the rafters before closing her eyes. Something was shifting on that ranch. She still didn't know if it was good or bad, but she knew it was shifting, and she had learned to fear change more than almost anything else. The days that followed carried the same routine as always, but with a different texture underneath it. Thomas showed up in the vineyard almost every day, always with some practical reason to be there. Grace had learned to feel his presence before she saw him. When he came near her row, she didn't grow more tense. She grew stiller, which was a different thing entirely. One Tuesday, while the crew ate lunch in the shade of a big oak tree, Ruth brought out some leftover biscuits from breakfast at the main house and passed them around to the women. When it was Grace's turn, Ruth lingered a second, studying her with an expression that wasn't evaluation, but wasn't just curiosity either. She said without much preamble that Grace cut grapes like she'd been born doing it. Grace answered that she'd worked fields since she was a child, that the body remembers movement even when the mind forgets. Ruth looked at her slowly, as if confirming something she'd already suspected, and walked off. That same afternoon, something happened that shifted the fragile balance building between them. One of the older workers on the crew, a man named Gus Whitmore, slipped between two rows and hurt his wrist badly. It wasn't serious, but it hurt, and the crew froze, not sure what to do. Grace didn't wait. She tore a strip from her own apron, improvised a firm splint with the calm competence of someone who had solved problems alone many times before, and helped him into the shade. Thomas was less than 100 feet away when it happened, checking a section for signs of pest damage. He watched the whole thing without her realizing she was being observed. He saw the speed, the steadiness of her hands, the calm on her face. When Walter arrived and checked the splint, he said it was done right, looking at Grace with a surprise he couldn't fully hide. She only said she'd learned that from an old camp nurse in a labor camp where she'd once worked, that sometimes knowing how to tend a wound was more useful than knowing how to read, and went back to her row like nothing had happened. Thomas stood there longer than necessary. There was something about that woman that unsettled him in a way he wasn't used to feeling. It wasn't just the competence, though, that was undeniable. It was the absence of vanity. She hadn't done it to be seen. She'd done it because it needed doing. And there was an integrity in that plainness that struck him as rare, because he had spent his whole life surrounded by people who calculated exactly what they'd gain before lifting a finger. That night, Harold sent for his son. The old man was sitting up in bed with pillows stacked behind him, his face grayer than it had been the week before, but his eyes still carried that intensity that hadn't given up even as his body had. He got straight to the point, as always. He said Eleanor Prescott had sent word through her brother, asking about where things stood. He said he no longer had the patience for delay, that the ranch needed continuity, that he wasn't going to last forever, and wanted to see his son settled before he passed. Thomas stood listening with the same square posture he'd developed over years of these conversations. When his father finished, he said he needed to think about it. Harold answered that there was nothing to think about, that hard decisions were almost always the simplest ones, once you took feeling out of the equation. Eleanor showed up at the ranch the following Saturday under the pretense of checking on Harold, an old family friend. She had a way of presenting herself that was clearly the product of a great deal of training. A fine dress, nothing overdone, words chosen with care. There was a social efficiency to her that Thomas recognized and that wore on him deeply. She stayed for lunch at the main house, and before leaving, standing on the porch with a tone meant to sound casual, she said the ranch was beautiful, that Harold needed peace and quiet, that the best thing his son could do for him was to take some of the worry off his shoulders. Thomas didn't answer. She left, leaving her expensive perfume in the air and the sense of an unfinished conversation behind her. Grace watched her arrive from the vineyard without paying much attention, but at dusk, passing near the main house, She caught the tone of Eleanor's voice saying goodbye to Thomas on the porch. She didn't hear the words. She heard the tone, the same honeyed tone she'd known from the women in her aunt's house whenever they wanted something from somebody. She kept walking, but she found herself thinking about it more than she wanted to. The following week, something small happened that lodged itself in both their memories, out of all proportion to its size. It was late afternoon when Grace discovered a crack in the bottom of her basket, and a good part of what she'd picked had spilled out along the row. She stood frozen for a moment, looking at the grapes scattered across the dirt, and something about that small moment hit her harder than it should have. Thomas came down the road at that exact instant. He saw the broken basket, saw Grace standing there with an expression that lasted only a second before she composed her face again. He said nothing about the basket. He got down off his horse, looked it over, and said he'd have Walter bring her a new one before dark. Then he said, in a voice that was direct but not hard, that the spilled fruit wouldn't be docked from her pay, that equipment was the ranch's responsibility, not hers. Grace looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. There was gratitude in it, but also something guarded, as if she were waiting for the second half of the sentence, the condition, the price that always seemed to come attached to kindness. When she understood there wasn't a second half, she said, "Thank you," with that economy of words that was her way. That week, Ruth found Grace alone in the kitchen one early morning and, without looking up from the dough she was kneading, said the ranch was going to need a seamstress once the harvest ended, that there was a backlog of work clothes waiting to be mended, and that Thomas hadn't sent for anyone yet. She asked if Grace knew how to sew. Grace said yes, that she'd learned as a girl. Ruth said she'd mention it to Thomas in the tone of someone handling routine business, but there was clearly something more than that in her eyes. That afternoon, Thomas received Ruth's suggestion with a casualness he knew was false. There was an undeniable practical logic to it. The clothes needed mending after all, but there was also a less convenient truth underneath. He didn't want that woman to leave when the harvest ended. The next morning, he told Walter to let the worker Grace know that once the harvest was finished, there would be sewing work available for anyone who wanted to stay. Grace got the news at dusk, between one row and the next, and accepted with the same flat practicality with which Walter delivered it. She stood staring at a cluster of grapes in her hand, feeling the small, firm weight of it, and for 1 second, only one, quickly shut away, she let herself feel that maybe, this time, it would be different. It was on the 16th day that Eleanor Prescott returned to the ranch, but this time it wasn't a visit to see Harold. Grace felt it before she understood what was happening. She saw Eleanor cross the yard toward the workers' quarters, accompanied by one of her own household staff. Walter appeared with the look of a man who'd been warned ahead of time, exchanged a few words, and then called for Grace. Eleanor studied her for a moment before speaking, with the kind of look that takes in a full assessment in a matter of seconds. She said in that honeyed voice that she understood Thomas was considering keeping her on at the ranch after the harvest, that it was probably nothing more than a passing kindness, but that it would be a favor to everyone if Grace understood her place there was temporary. And then she added one more thing, saving the sharpest blow for last, that she knew Grace had no known family in the area, that she was the kind of woman who drifted from ranch to ranch, and that for the sake of her own reputation, it would be wise not to create situations that could be misread. Grace listened to all of it, without her expression changing. There was a place inside her that already knew that speech by heart, in different voices, always carrying the same meaning. You don't belong here, so leave before you cause a problem. When Eleanor finished, Grace said she understood. That was all. Eleanor gave a courteous nod of the head and left. Grace went back to her row and kept cutting. Her hands didn't shake, her rhythm didn't change. On the outside, the same woman as always. On the inside, that familiar sensation of ground giving way beneath her feet. That night she pulled out the photograph of her mother and stared at it longer than usual. For the first time in many years, she felt the urge to cry in a way that wasn't sadness. It was exhaustion. Exhaustion from always having to prove she deserved to be wherever she was. She didn't cry. She put the photograph away and slept. On the other side of the ranch, Thomas had watched Eleanor leave with an expression he recognized in himself, the look of someone who had accomplished something planned, and a restlessness that kept him up half the night. The next morning, Grace woke determined to finish out the remaining weeks, collect her pay and move on, without waiting around for the sewing job, without settling somewhere Eleanor had already made clear she wasn't welcome. But stepping out of the bunkhouse into the cold morning light, walking across the yard, she felt a resistance in her chest she wasn't used to feeling. Something on that ranch had taken hold of her without asking permission. Thomas came down to the vineyard earlier than usual that day. He'd spent part of the night awake, and that morning he went to his father's room to ask what exactly Eleanor's visit had been about. Harold, more lucid than he'd been on other days, answered with a frankness that surprised him. He said he'd asked Eleanor to look into who the harvest workers were, that it was simple prudence, that the ranch carried responsibility for who moved through the property. Thomas listened and understood what hadn't been said out loud. His father had sent her away not because there was a problem with her work, but because he'd sensed his son's interest before Thomas had even admitted it to himself. He found Grace working alone in the farthest section of the vineyard. He got down off his horse and walked over to her. He said without preamble that he knew Eleanor had spoken with her the day before. Grace kept cutting and said yes, that they'd spoken, that Eleanor had made clear the sewing job probably wasn't going to happen, that it was better not to build up expectations. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the sewing job absolutely was going to happen, that he was the one who decided what work happened on that ranch, not Eleanor Prescott. Grace stopped cutting and looked at him for the first time that morning. She said he didn't need to do that she knew how to look after herself. He said he knew she knew how to look after herself. That had been clear from the very first day, that he wasn't doing it out of obligation or pity. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do. The days that followed brought a real subtle shift in tone. One afternoon it rained suddenly, a short, hard rain that caught the crew in the middle of the rows. They ran for a small tin lean-to that barely fit everyone. Grace ended up on the edge, catching the spray. Thomas rode up, saw the situation, dismounted, and without ceremony pulled off the oilcloth coat he was wearing and held it out to her, only to her, because it was the only one he had. She started to say she didn't need it. He said the rain would pass soon, but that wet clothes in the wind could give her a chill, and walked off to attend to something else without waiting for an answer. Grace stood there holding the coat, feeling the warmth it still carried from his body, and pulled it over her shoulders. When the rain stopped, she folded the coat carefully and left it draped over the branch of a tree where he'd see it on his way back. She left no note. The care with which she'd folded it was in itself a message that needed no words. There was 1 week left before the harvest ended, when Harold suffered a serious setback. The doctor who came out from town said his lungs were failing faster than expected, that it was a matter of months, maybe less. Thomas took the news standing with the same square posture as always, thanked the doctor, and sat alone at his desk for a long while. That night he went to his father's room and sat beside the bed for over an hour. They talked about old things, about Thomas's mother who had died when he was 16, about the first vineyard block they'd planted together when he was 12. In one pause, Harold said he knew it had been hard on him. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. That same week, before word came that Eleanor planned another visit, the scene happened that changed everything. Grace was working the highest section of the vineyard, with a view over the whole valley, when she cut her finger deep on the edge of a new basket. She was trying to tie off a strip of cloth one-handed, a frustrating task by nature. Thomas came down the upper road, saw the situation from a distance, dismounted and walked over. Without asking permission, he took her hand carefully, examined the cut, and began wrapping it with precision. Grace stood still, not from the cut, but from the contact. She wasn't used to being touched with care. Thomas finished the bandage, but didn't let go of her hand right away. He held it a second longer than necessary. She raised her eyes to his. He was looking at her with an expression that no longer carried any distance at all. Grace looked down first, said thank you in a voice slightly different than usual. He said it was nothing, told her to wash it well when she got back to her quarters and left. She stood there a while, looking at her bandaged finger, feeling the place where his hand had held hers. And then the tears came, not from pain, but from that deep place inside a person who has gone too long without receiving gentleness, and suddenly receives a little, and the whole body doesn't quite know how to hold it. 2 days before the harvest ended, Eleanor came back to the ranch one more time. She had lunch at the main house where Harold, weaker now but more direct than ever, said in front of everyone that he wanted to see his son settle his future before he passed. Thomas was quiet for a moment, that everyone at the table felt. Then he said in a calm voice that he respected his father and understood what he wanted, but that there were things he needed to decide for himself, that he would honor the family name through his work and his conduct, but that he couldn't promise a marriage that didn't come from the heart. Harold looked at him with those still intense eyes. Eleanor sat frozen with her fork in the air. When Eleanor left that afternoon, without the honeyed smile this time, she told Thomas he was making a mistake, that after his father was gone, he would need alliances, that he was throwing all of that away for a farmhand with no past and no name, and that once the novelty wore off he would regret it. Thomas answered that she might be right, that he could very well come to regret it, but that the regret that worried him most wasn't the regret of choosing wrong. It was the regret of never truly choosing at all. The harvest ended on a clear Monday. The workers lined up and collected their pay as promised. The crew left that afternoon. Grace, unlike the other times she'd moved on, had no plan formed. Ruth appeared at her bunkhouse door with a plate of food and said the back room at the main house was clean and ready, that there was a backlog of mending waiting, that Thomas had confirmed the sewing job still stood. Grace looked at her worn traveling bag, the same one that had carried her since she walked away from her aunt's house at 17, and said she'd stay. Thomas learned she'd stayed through Walter and stood there for a moment with his pen in his hand, looking out the window at the now empty fields, feeling a lightness he hadn't felt in years. Grace's first days in the main house were a careful adjustment, but Ruth treated the kitchen as shared ground from day one. And Thomas greeted her with that easy familiarity she was beginning to recognize as his way of telling her she belonged there. The sewing work was plentiful, and there was a real pleasure in organizing it, the pleasure of having something of her own that no one could take away as long as she did it well. One afternoon during her second week, while she sewed at the porch table, Thomas came and sat across from her with a cup of coffee Ruth had sent out for both of them. He started talking about a problem with one of the harvest presses. She listened, asked a practical question, suggested something she'd seen work on another ranch. He considered the suggestion seriously. It was an unremarkable conversation, and it was the most important one they'd had yet, because neither of them was being careful anymore. Harold faded slowly over the weeks that followed. On one of his better afternoons, he sent for Grace and asked if she could mend an old shirt he'd kept folded away in a trunk from the years he used to travel for business, so he could wear it one more time. Grace said yes, that she'd leave it better than new. She returned it to him 2 days later, the repair done so well you had to know exactly where to look to find it. Harold died early one October morning, 4 weeks later without struggle, his lungs simply stopping their work while he slept. After the small burial at the town cemetery, after the last neighbor had gone and the house had settled back into silence, Thomas went out to the porch and stood looking at the darkening valley. Grace appeared in the doorway, stood there a moment, and then walked over to stand beside him at the railing. Neither of them needed to say anything. They stayed like that for a long while that neither one measured. Thomas said, without turning, that his father had built all of it, every fence post, every row of vines, and that there was a kind of greatness in it he sometimes forgot to see. Grace said she saw it too, that when she'd first arrived and looked out over the ranch, she'd thought it was the kind of place a person spends their whole life trying to build and doesn't always manage to finish. Thomas turned to look at her with the expression of someone who has just been seen in a way he didn't expect. He said she had stayed. She said yes. He said it made him glad. She said, with that same directness that was her way, that it made her glad too. Thomas then said he wanted to ask her something plainly, because he didn't know any other way, whether she wanted to keep staying, not only as a seamstress, but truly as part of the life he was trying to figure out how to build. Grace looked at him with the attention given to something important before answering. In her was the whole of the woman who had learned to fend for herself since she was 8 years old, who had run away from home with a small bag and never once looked back, who had carried a photograph she could barely bring herself to look at. And there was, for the first time in that entire life, someone asking her if she wanted to stay without needing to prove anything first. She said she wanted to stay, with a clarity that left no room for doubt. The months that followed were months of slow, real building. There were difficulties. The town talked, the way small towns always talk. At the feed store and the little Sunday church social, women who had never once spoken a word to Grace suddenly had a great deal to say about her, about how convenient it was that she'd turned up right when the old man's health started failing, about what kind of woman follows harvest crews from ranch to ranch in the first place. One afternoon at the general store, the clerk's wife made a comment just loud enough to carry, something about girls who knew exactly which door to walk through when a man was grieving and vulnerable. Grace stood at the counter and said nothing, paid for her thread and walked out with her spine straight, the same way she'd walked out of 100 rooms before that one. Thomas heard about it before the week was out, and he did something he had never done in all his years running the ranch. He rode into town on a Saturday morning, walked into that same general store, and in front of half a dozen customers said plainly that Grace Bennett was going to be his wife, that anyone who had something to say about her character could say it to his face instead of behind her back, and that he'd remember who said what. He wasn't a man given to speeches, and the town knew it, which was exactly why the words landed the way they did. The gossip didn't stop overnight, but it grew quieter, and it grew more careful, and that was enough. Grace, who had spent her whole life bracing for the next rejection, learned slowly that there was a real difference between places where you are merely tolerated and places where you belong. She started attending the Sunday social herself after that, not because she needed anyone's approval, but because she was tired of letting other people's opinions decide where she could and couldn't stand. Ruth walked in beside her the first time, arms linked, daring anyone with her eyes to say a word. They married on an October afternoon the following year, a simple ceremony at the town church. Ruth was there in her Sunday apron. Walter stood with the expression of a man carrying out a solemn duty. A handful of neighbors came, the ones who had chosen to see Grace for who she really was. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Grace felt something without a clear name, but good and enormous and quiet. The feeling of solid ground after years of walking on earth that could give way at any moment. 3 years later, their first daughter was born, and they named her Margaret. 3 years after that came a son, whom they named Harold in memory of the old man. Grace, who had grown up with no one waiting for her anywhere, learned what it meant to have a house full of voices looking for her, small hands tugging at her skirt, a place at the table that was hers by right and not by charity. Sometimes, sewing on the porch while the children played in the yard, she would look out over the valley and feel that the girl who used to wash clothes in the creek before dawn had finally found where she was meant to land. Many years later, when Grace's hair had gone streaked with white that she never once tried to hide, she still sat on the porch of the main house, sewing with those same precise stitches that no one else could match. Thomas came in from the fields on horseback, the way he did every day, and she heard the hoofbeats before she saw him, the way it had always been. He sat down beside her with the coffee Ruth had left out, and said, without any introduction, that a new crew of harvest workers was arriving the following week for the next crush. She said she already knew. He looked at her for a moment, with that gratitude he'd never learned to put into words, but that she had spent years learning to read anyway. He said that when he looked out at the vineyard rows down below, he could still see her arriving that first afternoon, bag in hand, with no idea she was about to stay. Grace looked up from her sewing and met his eyes. She said she saw it too, that sometimes she'd catch the smell of ripe grapes and remember the cold mornings, the hard road, the years before, and that remembering it didn't hurt anymore. He asked her why. She said it was because now it was only a memory, and it was no longer her destiny. Thomas took her hand, the same hand that still carried the faint marks of a needle from all those years, and held it slowly. Below them the valley lay quiet and vast in the fading light. Somewhere among the vines a bird sang once and went silent. Margaret came around the side of the house then, a grown woman herself now with children of her own trailing behind her, calling out that supper was nearly ready, and did they intend to sit out there until the stars came in? Grace laughed, the sound easy and unguarded in a way it had never been in the first years of her life, and said they'd be along directly. She watched her daughter herd the grandchildren back toward the kitchen, watched the porch light come on in the window, where Ruth, older now and slower but still ruling the stove like a general, moved between the pots. Harold Jr. rode in from the far pasture, just as the sun dropped behind the ridge, lifting a hand in greeting the way his father always had. Grace turned back to Thomas and said that when she was a girl, sleeping on dirt floors and eating what was left after everyone else had eaten, she never once let herself imagine a porch like this one, a family like this one, because imagining it and not getting it would have been its own kind of cruelty. She said she was glad she'd been wrong to guard herself so carefully. Thomas said he was glad too, that he had spent the first 42 years of his life doing exactly what was expected of him, and had nearly missed the one thing that was never expected at all. He said the ranch would go on, the vines would go on, new crews would keep arriving every fall the way they always had, but none of that would have meant anything without her walking up that road with a bag in her hand and no idea she was about to stay. And there, on that porch, two people who had each learned the hard way what it meant to be alone sat together a while longer, looking out at the life they had built with their own hands, before finally rising to go in and join the noise and the warmth of the family waiting for them. It was more than enough. It was everything. If this story moved you, drop a comment below and tell me which part stuck with you the most. I read every single one. Hit that like button if you want to see more stories like this. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. See you in the next story.